All right.
So welcome, everyone. We are here with Dr. Holly Pinheiro of Furman University, who has come to talk to us at the Center for Gender Justice about the Family Civil War, Black Soldiers and the Fight for Racial Justice, based on his book coming out in this year, in just a few months. And I hope that Dr. Pinheiro will talk to us about this topic and then maybe also about his journey to how he came to be interested in it, to how he came to be a professor. I just want to say that he started out getting his associate's degree at Valencia Community College and now is a professor studying these awesome topics. So I know a lot of our students are also on a similar path, rocking it from community college. And so welcome, Dr. Pinheiro, and I will turn it over to you.
All right. Firstly, thank you very much. I would like to say my sincerest thank yous to John Jay College of Criminal Justice, the Center for Gender Justice, Dr. Erin L. Thompson for providing me with this opportunity to speak with you all about my research, which is my forthcoming book, The Family Civil War, coming out, I believe, June of this year, June 10th. And yes, I am more than excited to talk with you about my experiences going from community college. I was actually talking before we started about some of the awesome classes I took, but also the confidence that it gave me being in that setting and then transitioning to going to a larger institution. All right, turn on my timer. On April 8th, 1884, Mary Williamson, the widow of deceased 6th United States Colored Infantry, or USCI soldier, Benjamin Davis, met with the Bureau of Pensions at their local office in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Williamson came to provide testimony to a special examiner regarding the validity of the miners' pension case for their now adult son, Jerome. During this deposition, which was going for nearly 2+ years, the presiding pension agent began to question the legitimacy of Williamson's common law marriage to Benjamin and about their child. Now, maybe Mary grew tired of having to explain herself to a federal government representative as she emphasized how the Civil War forever changed their family. And here's a back and forth between them. Quote, "I kept him, Jerome Davis, until he was 7 or 8 months old, when I took him to his grandfather's at his father's request, and he, his grandfather, has brought him up and took him ever since 1864. What is the reason you did not keep or care for him? Because I had to go to service, and they were willing to care for him. They, the United States Army, drafted men and left no means to work ourselves," end quote. Now, Williamson's statement illustrates the harsh reality that she and countless other working poor African-American Philadelphians experienced during and after the Civil War. Scholarship on United States colored troops or USCT regiments has long emphasized aspects of military service, such as wartime mobilization, and rightly so, as USCT soldiers sacrificed their lives for the greater good of the United States and for their enslaved brethren. Other men served to have their manhood recognized by white society. The lived experiences of working poor Northern USCT soldiers' families, however, has been largely overlooked. Now, Williamson's testimony, I believe, sheds light onto how the war tore African-American Philadelphian husbands from wives, fathers from children, children from parents, and friends from friends. The USCT was pivotal in carrying out the United States military objectives, yet the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of able-bodied African-American men into the service devastated many of these families. Some families were left to grieve and struggle economically after their male kin died in service. And other families tended to disabilities, physical, emotional, and psychological, of surviving veterans while also fighting to survive financially. Now, before diving into aspects of my forthcoming book, The Family Civil War, coming out again in June of this year, it is necessary to situate within the historiography. Even with the wealth of USCT scholarship, one might forget that it was not until the 1950s when modern scholars recognized the historical significance of USCT soldiers. For example, Frederick M. Bender and Dudley Taylor Cornish published studies that provided overviews of the USCT's events. In 1965, James McPherson followed suit with an examination of the processes of wartime mobilization and the immediate post-war issues related to African Americans. Collectively, these studies sought to illuminate a forgotten past. Quote, "The history of the Negro soldier in the Union Army remains an obscure chapter in American history," end quote, Cornish writes. For white non-academics and scholars, this statement was perhaps correct, but numerous African Americans and some of their white allies knew otherwise. Now, during the late 19th century and early 20th century, historical analyses of USCT regiments primarily came from African Americans. For example, African American civilian William Wells Brown composed his monograph, "The Negro in the American Rebellion, His Heroism and Fidelity," in 1867, after noticing that white historians either downplayed or ignored the historical of USCT regiments. Quote, "I patiently waited before beginning this work with the hope that someone more competent would take up the subject at hand. But up to the present," Brown laments, "it has not been done, although many books have been written about the rebellion," end quote. The literature of William J. Simmons, George Washington Williams, Joseph T. Wilson, Alexander Heritage Newton, and Isaac J. Hill all investigated soldiers' wartime sacrifices. Meanwhile, some USCT veterans made it their personal mission to inform civilians, including Carter G. Woodson, about their wartime exploits. Additionally, Susie King Taylor, a formerly enslaved woman, published her experiences as a laundress and later as a nurse in the 33rd USCI, in addition to highlighting the post-war struggles that her family experienced, particularly that being her husband, Edward, who was a USCT veteran who was unable to find work as a skilled carpenter because of his race. Thus, African Americans and their allies fought for the inclusion in the historical memory of the Civil War that did not materialize until the modern civil rights movement. Now, 5 of the men previously mentioned served in Northern African American regiments. Simmons enlisted in the 41st USCI, Wilson was in the 54th Massachusetts, Williams served in the 13th USCI, and Hill and Newton both served in the 29th USCI. Afterwards, all of these veterans became historians to confront whites, scholars, and non-academics, and even some African Americans who ignored the historical significance of USCT soldiers. Simmons, for instance, lamented in 1887 the fact that his students, most likely at the Simmons College of Kentucky, where he worked, knew little about USCT soldiers. Quote, "I have noticed in my long experience as a teacher that some of my students are woefully ignorant of the work of our great colored men, even ignorant of their names," end quote, he states. Ultimately, the family civil war builds upon the efforts that began more than 130 years ago to uncover the personal histories of USCT soldiers and their extended families in a manner that brings their names and experiences to the forefront. Now, at least for Simmons, his monograph's dedication allowed him to honor the prominent role that African American women had in shaping the lives of all African Americans. Quote, "This volume is respectfully dedicated to the women of our race," he writes, "and especially the devoted, self-sacrificing mothers who molded the lives of the subjects of the sketches, laboring and praying for their success," end quote. Simmons understood the invaluable contributions that African American families, especially women, made in the lives of USCT soldiers. But rather than limit the discussion of kin to a small portion of the book, USCT soldiers' families must be at the center of a historical analysis. Doing so reveals how Northern African American families continuously fought against racially discriminatory barriers that whites imposed in attempts to oppress them every second of their lives. The Civil War was neither a conflict between two armies, nor was it solely about political disputes that spanned regions or races. It was a war that provided African Americans with the ability to demand equality in American society, but doing so had the capacity to create lasting problems for the families of these soldiers. Now, historians tend to focus on isolated moments of USCT soldiers' experiences, either wartime or post-war, to illustrate the various hardships that they and usually their blood-related kin experienced. Wartime studies illuminate how racial discrimination in service made the military experience for African American men dramatically different from all other soldiers. Some detail how white officers readily meted out physical punishments on USCT soldiers who, because of their supposed racial inferiority and untrustworthiness, were thought to have deserved such cruel punishments. Margaret Humphreys argues that due to racially discriminatory policies based on pseudo-racial science, USCT soldiers primarily performed fatigue duty in harsh climates, which led to more deaths from illness and disease than from Confederate weaponry. Now, veteranhood scholars stress how white pension agents discriminated against and routinely denied African-American Civil War pension applicants, primarily on the conviction that they lied. James G. Mendez is the only scholar to date who has placed Northern USCT soldiers' families at the center of his study. Though his work is focusing primarily on the letters of African-American women, that being mothers, wives, sisters, and family friends. Now, having said that, Dr. Mendez's book is absolutely phenomenal. It came out with Furman University Press in 2019. I believe it's called The Great Sacrifice. I cannot recommend it enough. Now, in terms of the research questions, my monograph, The Family Civil War, is guided by three essential inquiries. The first and arguably most important question that I'm investigating is how did the enlistment of native-born African-American Philadelphian men into the United States Army immediately create, and in some cases enduring, financial hardships that impacted the individuals of multi-generational families who were left behind? Second, how did the continuance of societal racism by federal government agents and various members of Northern and Southern society collectively contribute or hinder the household finances for these working poor USCT veterans and their families in the late 19th and early 20th century? Finally, who were these people beyond their military service? Now getting into the specifics of my work. It is well known, thanks to a growing body of scholarship, that the enlistment campaign for Northern African American men in cities, including Philadelphia, that war propagandists such as Frederick Douglass, Anna Dickinson, and Henry Highland Garnet emphasized the supposed responsibilities that able-bodied African American men had to emancipate their enslaved Southern brethren. Enlistment rhetoric claimed that demonstrating one's patriotic manhood would allow them to acquire full citizenship rights, including voting rights, possibly. War propagandists collectively recognized that all USCT soldiers would experience, unfortunately, racial discrimination in service. Even so, potential USCT recruits were told to focus on ending slavery while simultaneously proving that African American manhood paralleled their white counterparts. In doing so, war propagandists believed that it could lead to USCT soldiers and African Americans possibly attaining post-war rights, such as suffrage rights and the protection of their civil rights, while refuting negative racial stereotypes, all through military service. Unfortunately, for many African American Northern families, wartime mobilization ignored the dire economic situations that they experienced every day in American society. And the removal of able-bodied African-American men hindered an ongoing economic crisis for working poor African-American Philadelphian families who were already suffering due to racial discrimination that impacted their lives. And in some cases, their financial woes continued generations after the war ended, unfortunately. Now, military service did not exist in isolated segments of soldiers' lives. Although different from soldiers on the front line, the families of USCT soldiers also dealt with the consequences of military participation, as the effects had the ability to reverberate to the home front in ways that very few, including the soldiers, anticipated. The notion that serving in USCT regiments would demonstrate the plausibility for creating a racially egalitarian society that would only occur if African-American men became soldiers and defenders for a nation that legalized slavery and the oppression of free African-Americans ignored the fact that these men had to sacrifice their lives to do so. Nor was there any recognition of how it could impact the recruits' families. At the same time, surviving the war did not necessarily improve the socioeconomic standing for many of the soldiers or their families. Now, Philadelphia, I believe, is an ideal location to examine free Northern African Americans who navigated a city with extreme partisanship and racial politics, where racial violence, unfortunately, including large-scale race riots, were commonplace throughout the 19th century. So on my screen, you'll see an image of one of the most infamous in Pennsylvania history that happened in 1838 at the Pennsylvania Hall. And one of the impetus for this violence was the anger when locals saw Black and white women who are abolitionists walking arm in arm down the street. After burning this institution, they then turned their attack in the Black community, burning churches, schools, and homes. And the police would later arrest the Black community, claiming that it was all their fault to begin with. Still, Philadelphia had the most significant free Northern African American population in 1860 with over 22,000, which was over 4% of the city's total population at that time. Philadelphia also had one of the most prominent abolitionist networks that included nationally recognized activists such as Octavius Cotto, who is going to be a future USCT recruiter, and Lucretia Mott, who is one of the most important women, not only in women's rights history, but also in USCT support, which is actually going to be the foundation for my second book, because her family will donate their land that leads to the creation of Camp William Penn, which I will talk about shortly. These are just some of the reasons that I believe Philadelphia is the ideal location to investigate. Now, Pennsylvania will raise 3 regiments that I'm going to focus on for this first book, that being the 3rd United States Colored Infantry, the 6th, and the 8th USCI, which all trained in Philadelphia, where the majority of the recruiting also took place. In essence, Civil War military service was inescapable for African-American Philadelphians by 1863, as the militarization of the city was inescapable, as the city and its populace pressed onward to support the United States war effort. However, many people advocating for African-American men to enlist into the United States Army seem to either ignore or downplay the harsh reality of life that all African Americans, due to racial discrimination in every facet of Northern society, lived through every day as they battled for their survival, literally and economically. In total, 185 Philadelphia native-born men served in one of these 3 Pennsylvania USCT regiments that I study. To be clear, this number does not comprise even 1% of the city's total African American population. And since each regiment usually capped at 1,000 enlisted men, the soldiers that I examined encompass over 6% of the collective regiment's population. Regardless of their small proportion, every one of their lives mattered. Moreover, these men were never merely cannon fodder, military laborers, or even emancipators. These were fathers, brothers, sons, cousins, and friends to a marginalized segment of Philadelphians residing in households where individuals, sometimes children as young as 5 years old, had to contribute to their family's household finances to stave off poverty, if only temporarily. Now, my book explores how free-born Northern African American Philadelphians strive to create and maintain families while continuously fighting against various forms of racial discrimination from 1850 into the 1930s. Soldiering made their families' already dire circumstances even worse, and unfortunately spanned multiple generations. By doing so, this project examines the often overlooked and understudied experiences of free-born Northern African Americans. And this collective of people dealt with their own hardships of racial discrimination that were starkly different from their enslaved brethren in the South. And at least 79,000 African Americans will serve in Northern USCT regiments, with a number of them, including most of the USCT veterans examined in my work, remained in the North and comprised a sizable population of racial minorities living outside of the Confederacy. In total, the project actually examines nearly 1,000 individuals in multi-generational families who dealt with the long-term ramifications of Civil War military service, primarily due to the continuance of occupational racial discrimination, racism that the men dealt with in service, and the racially discriminatory practices throughout the Civil War pension application process for both invalid or veterans and their dependents collectively jeopardize the finances of many working poor African American families. These effects were felt far beyond any degree that the federal government, war propagandists, and even the soldiers themselves could comprehend when the call to arms came. But it's also important to recognize that the family civil war is more than a Civil War history. I seek to also include contributions in the scholarship on Northern urban African American history, and studying the lived experiences of Philadelphian-born USCT veterans and their king across multiple generations allows for new avenues of scholarly analysis. And moreover, this approach will allow readers to recognize how these important and understudied historical figures fought and persevered against racism in and outside of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. Thus, it is time to acknowledge that the lives of USCT soldiers and their families did not stop or start with some specific historical moment. Rather, they existed over expansive periods of time that transcended our conventional periodization of historical inquiry. But how did I do the work? I just briefly want to touch on the methods and resources that I used to do it. Rather than conduct a random sample, I examined Philadelphian-born African-American men who either served again in the 3rd, the 6th, or the 8th USCI, which totals 185 soldiers. But by including their families, that number jumps up to nearly 1,000 people. And I am not claiming that this specific group of people is representative for the African-American experience. And unlike other African-American Philadelphians, this group of individuals had a unique relationship with the federal government, and the U.S. Army, as Civil War service, potentially gave them access to federally sponsored social welfare and a way to have their lives, including their hardships, documented in federal government records. Ultimately, USCT soldiers is only the beginning point to understanding the complexity of Northern African-American familial life. In order to answer the questions guiding my work, I rely on a comprehensive study of the primary sources you see here, which includes Civil War pension records, and I am extremely happy to talk about the challenges, but also the excitement with going through those records. And that includes, I have a number of pension records related to New York USCT soldiers as well. Compiled military service records, regimental books, USCT soldiers published memoirs, city directories, the federal census, which is also a goldmine, public speeches by prominent individuals, men, women, white, and African American, the Union League organization records in Philadelphia, though I do want to acknowledge there was, and I believe still is, a Union League in New York City, along with newspapers, white and African American, particularly the Christian Recorder and the Weekly Anglo-African, which published out in New York City. Those two presses were gold mines in terms of sources and thoughts from USCT soldiers, because the newspapers always published their feelings and thoughts and frustrations on military service. But now that I've laid that all out, I would like to give you one of the many examples. In 1842, Andrew White, the son of Sarah and an unnamed man, was born in Philadelphia. Sarah, for undisclosed reasons, became a single mother, raising 4 children, including Andrew, by herself until she married James Reeves on an undisclosed date. In total, the couple would raise 7 children that created significant economic burdens on the family, as James was the only documented full-time wage earner as a laborer who, due to racial discrimination, was an unfortunate common occupation for many African Americans to support his family. Now, perhaps Sarah found part-time work to bolster the family economy in between raising the children at home. None of these 7 children attended school when they were school age, and their absences from school were not unique, as many other working poor African-American Philadelphians and New Yorker families chose not to send their children to racially segregated schools that were inferior in nearly every facet to their white counterparts, such as having unqualified and openly racist teachers and continually dealing with funding problems and overcrowding. Other families needed their children to forego a formal education and required the youth, sometimes 5 years old, to find wage-earning employment, even temporarily, to supplement their income. And there are numerous instances of the soldiers that I study who do this, including some being chimney sweeps and even firemen. It is entirely plausible that the Reeves children, including Andrew, had these experiences, which illustrated that race defined one's access to education and a social hierarchy that ignored an individual's age. Now, for Andrew, reaching young adulthood forced him to assume more familiar responsibilities after his stepfather was no longer able to perform his duties as a laborer after he incurred a hernia and rheumatism due to an exposure while working. Andrew was able to find work as a farm laborer and earned $8 per month, and that number will be important not only to his family, but to a point I'm going to raise again later. Again, $8 per month. The majority of his wages went to help his parents and siblings survive, as he was again the only documented full-time wage earner in his home. Andrew's familial obligations were well known among members of his local community. James Seaman and Henry Ellis, both childhood friends of Andrew, later testified that he was critical as the provider for their entire family after his stepfather's afflictions materialized. Now, as a bachelor, Andrew assumed the idealized male role as the breadwinner, even though his stepfather still resided in the household. Perhaps this gave Andrew a conflicted understanding of gender ideology that many middle-class Americans championed. Alternatively, maybe what mattered more to Andrew was keeping his family economically stable through his labor, which meant that material realities for this particular working poor family were starkly different from Victoria-era gender roles. Eventually, Andrew answered the United States mobilizing call to arms, and he enlisted on August 12th of 1863 into the 6th USCI. So on the left is an image of Camp William Penn. Again, Lucretia Mott's family will donate that land. And there is so much rich history that is and should be done on it, again, because there's so many interconnections by many famous and unknown historical figures. And then on the right is the regimental flag of the 6th Regiment that Andrew and others served in. Records do not reveal what Andrew's motivations were for serving in the military. However, it is clear that his decision to fight created an immediate problem for his family, as he did not receive his $100 federal enlistment bounty, as the payment would be given at the end of his service. And the Reeves family was now without their breadwinner, and it meant that their finances became extremely chaotic, as patriotism and militarized manhood trumped familial responsibilities. Now, serving in the United States Army did not cease Andrew from seeking to maintain a close relationship with his family back home. On March 25th of 1864, Andrew wrote Sarah and informed her of his time near camp at Yorktown in Virginia. In the letter, he exclaimed his adoration for his family at home that he missed dearly. Andrew then complained about his financial woes, which were making it harder for him to communicate with them, when he wrote, quote, "Dear mother, I hope you do not think hard of me for not writing you any sooner. I could not get any paper to write you any sooner, because paper is hard to get here without any money," end quote. Perhaps his complaint about his inability to afford paper was due to the inefficiency of military paymasters who rarely paid any soldier in a timely fashion. He then beseeched his mother to write him so that he could remain updated on how they were doing in his absence. And it is feasible that Andrew's request was probably his way of recognizing how his military service had jeopardized the finances of his camp. For men like Andrew, armed combat was a defining component of military service, and without it, it was incomplete. He wrote, quote, in the same letter, "I have not been in a fight yet, but I have been in some very hard marches for a fight, but the rebel was afraid to stand up," end quote. Andrew's proud tone reveals that his and the regiment's manhood was on full display, while Confederate soldiers were, in his opinion, void of masculine patriotic honor for their unwillingness to engage in armed combat. Maybe his family took pride in the confidence and bravery that Andrew showed, but it also meant that their breadwinner and son and brother pined to sacrifice his life. All right, full disclosure, this is not actually the battle that I'm going to talk about. This is the Battle of Olustee, which took place in February 20th of 1864 and is extremely important, does connect to my research, but the image will get across the points, unfortunately, that I'm about to point out here with Andrew. And I'm happy to talk about this battle as well, because there's some great public history that's being done on this. Unfortunately, Andrew's wish came true as he received an injury on June 30th of 1864 at the Battle of Point of Rock in Virginia. He would later die from those injuries. And once the news came home, his mother, Sarah, promptly applied for a mother's pension in the hopes of receiving some financial compensation after her son's passing. Now, to be clear, she was only qualified because Andrew had died a bachelor. Otherwise, she would have been ineligible. And there is a whole complicated process with the pensions and dependents, and I'm happy to clarify that because it can be confusing and it's very bureaucratic. None of his siblings at the same time were eligible because they were neither his wife or offspring, and his stepfather, for unknown reasons, did not apply for a pension. Sarah had her pension application approved, and she received Andrew's $100 federal enlistment bounty and a pension of $8 per month beginning in 1864, the same amount that he was making as a farm laborer that she would continue earning for the remainder of her life. In 1886, the pension rose to $12 per month. In 1896, it rose to $33 per month. But to be clear, as historian Larry Logue has argued, pensions were only meant to supplement an individual's income. Members of Sarah's local community, such as H. Powell, stated that throughout the late 19th century that Sarah frequently depended on the kindness of her neighbors to survive, when he said, quote, "She is a widow over 70 years of age and quite decrepit. She has been supported on the charitable people of her neighborhood," end quote. Additionally, Sarah resorted to selling cakes and candies to bolster her finances whenever possible. And since Sarah was the only documented individual in her household receiving money, it is feasible that it was never enough, it was rarely, if ever enough, to provide fiscal stability for their entire family. Now, becoming a pensioner did not stop federal government representatives, that being pension agents who were predominantly white men, from investigating the private life of Sarah. Shortly after James died of pneumonia in 1886, pension agents began an invasive examination of his employment and disability history to determine if Sarah should keep her pension or if she'd been defrauding the federal government all along. Thomas Hoffman and Henry Gamble both testified that it was James's disabilities and not a dereliction of his supposed male responsibilities that kept him from working. Meanwhile, multiple childhood friends of Andrew confirmed that he was the sole full-time wage earner for his family, which confirmed Sarah's financial dependency on her son. After the intrusive inquiry by the federal government, Sarah's pension continued. But it was only after questioning her validity and documenting her hardships to appease the skepticism of these pension agents, again, over multiple years. And in the end, Andrew continued contributing to his family's finances even after death. But it is plausible that his family would have rather had him return home safely instead of receiving financial compensation for his passing. In closing, placing African American families at the forefront, I believe, not only addresses historical gaps that African Americans historians made in the late 19th century, it also incorporates current gender and social historical analyses that bridges the gaps between his scholars over 100 years removed from each other. USCT families not only fill historical analytical voids, but demonstrate that there are still important studies remaining in both Civil War and African American scholarship. Now, examining the finances of USCT soldiers' families reveals a grim reality that touched the lives of hundreds of individuals who, in many cases, often significantly damaged their economic stability for years, if not generations. Racial discrimination was inescapable for African American civilians and veterans, as unemployment, hardships in service, and barriers imposed by white society kept them from establishing a truly racially egalitarian society that war propagandists had assumed would occur after the war closed. African American enlisted men may have been national heroes to some individuals as they included themselves in the national politics and reframing gender ideology. However, it is vital that we recognize who these men were as individuals beyond their military service. African American families rarely mattered in the national wartime narrative, other than as supporters of the war effort or as soldiers sacrificing their lives. And the struggles that families experienced was unfortunately of minimal significance to war propagandists and the military during the war. And while the federal government did supplement the finances of some invalids, again, veterans, and some nuclear familial dependents, it only came, unfortunately, after an overwhelming inundation of scrutiny into the personal lives of African Americans for generations after the war stopped. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions, and I know I have about 1 billion. So if you have anyone who's listening, you can put them in the chat. You can raise your hand. I'll start with something that struck me as you're speaking to the end about what you call an invasive examination of the pension lives of pension officials into the lives of Black veterans and family members. Seems like it's really something that is the prehistory of similar invasive examinations of public benefits, I guess really since then and continuing into the present. Do you think there's a relationship? I mean, of course, there's some relationship of it.
No, you've actually just introduced a new potential Black perspectives piece into my head.
Hey.
So
I should note that to the listening audience, check out Holly's Black perspective pieces, which are public history. So a sort of summaries of history, but not making it less cool, just making it more cool.
Usually more accessible, less dense. Just, and they're quick reads. They're like 1,200 words. So one thing I always want to do is make sure to nod all the other scholars who influenced my work. I will say, if I was at my office, I had the book with me. Brandy Clay Brimmer. She wrote the book called Claiming Union Widowhood, came out with Duke University Press last year. Actually, I got it for a Christmas gift last year. That's right. Or 2 years ago. Oh gosh, time flies. And she explicitly states she's looking at North Carolinian families connected to USCT soldiers. And she argues that, first of all, the Civil War pensions were the first federally sponsored social welfare program. And they date all the way back to the Revolution. And there were at least 18 Black men that were pensioners going back that far. And the one interesting thing, and there are many problems with the pensions, is that it's a way to document the lives of African Americans when people were saying, including even in class, how can we find these people's stories? They're there. But the thing that Dr. Brimmer brings up is that there's this, what she calls a grassroots pension network. And basically, if I was the relative trying to apply, and Dr. Thompson had gone through the process, she might be helping me and giving information and saying, don't talk to this person, get this witness, here's what you say, here's what you don't say, right? And it's just, it provides more agency through this process, even though there is no question that the inundation into the private lives of these people was, there's things I should not know. There's things I did not disclose in some of my writings because I'm like, this is just too much. And I did use some examples just to demonstrate the attacks on Black families, because I do believe the Civil War pension process, which actually at one point took up the majority of the federal budget, and presidential campaigns were directly tied to either accessibility or not of pensions. That's how important they were. They will demand the legitimacy of particularly African American families. And it gets harder, particularly for freeborn African Americans who don't, for different reasons, usually I'm going to say because of the agency. For example, by not getting a legal marriage, it gives both parties the ability to leave without the economic recourse of going through a divorce. And it provides Black women the agency, particularly in some of the soldiers' instances, when they're demonstrating violence against their families because they have what we know as PTSD. But from the federal government's perspective, you should have got a legal marriage. And because you didn't, we're going to shame you, and we're going to question the legitimacy of your child, which is how I opened up the presentation. Benjamin Davis, he will die as a prisoner of war for refusing to dig a ditch. Mary Williamson, they are a family I track throughout the entire book. Their story is sad. Like, it's absolutely depressing, but it's also empowering, because once she gives birth to Jerome, she brings the child to Camp William Penn and forces Benjamin, before giving up guardianship in front of all the other soldiers, to admit publicly that that is their child. And other veterans in the record were like, yeah, we still remember it. It was that uncomfortable of a situation. But because she did that, that actually helped the child, get the pension, because they hadn't gone through the legal process. But it's really complicated, messy, and I'm doing the academic thing of talking too much. So I saw a question about the newspapers, and I'm also happy to talk about New York City. I have a lot of knowledge on that.
Yeah, well, I before you answer that question, I just wanted to put in a recommendation for Hugh Ryan's forthcoming book on the Women's House of Detention, which was a really important site of queer history in Greenwich Village. And he had to do something similar of reconstructing the lives of women and other people held there through records from prison officials, through social workers, through psychologists, and this uncomfortable process of, how much do I reveal? But this is the only place where these people's voices survive, because they have been so hidden in history. But how do you do history against the grain of the source is a really fascinating question.
That's a great point. That also reminds me of Darius Carter. He's done exceptional work. Like, he's someone that has also done these kind of recovery histories of using sources that are very invasive and very difficult, because of just like, I always try to imagine what it must have been like to have to disclose information to a committee over multiple years, and the hyper observation that the federal government's agents will do into the lives of, you've sacrificed your family, but prove your family is worthy of like this. On the flip side, what I'm trying to do, and many other scholars have done this, to be clear, like whether we're talking Amy Morrell Taylor, Chandra Manning, Norley Frankel, Donald Schaefer, and many others, is say that we must recognize agency even in the face of various forms of oppression and discrimination. There is no question that those records, any of these kind of records, reveal too much about the private lives. On the flip side, these people were demanding to be heard. And even in a rejection, they are saying, you're going to hear my story. And one of the things I try to do is even go at the narrative of the lost cause. I don't agree with and many others don't agree with the lost cause narrative. If you even look at a pension record where the federal government is recording the Civil War experience and its lasting history on these people who, as Hillary Green notes, were living monuments. They were living through the war. And I close my book, and I'm spoiling the ending, with a daughter in 1930 writing to the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and beseeching assistance for a pension because her mother is dying of cancer. And Eleanor responds in 7 days. And it was absolutely amazing, because she's like, I want an answer. And the First Lady gets an answer and starts conversations with this daughter. I'm not going to spoil how it ends. But what I saw was that the First Lady, by the book, the First Lady.
Yeah, I want to. It just doesn't come out for so long. Come on.
For me, I never thought of Eleanor Roosevelt in connection to Black military service, but there was like a prime example. And it's also recognizing the daughter in generations later saying, remember what we gave. Remember how it's still with us. And yes, like, things are hard, but like, hear us, see us. We matter. And that's like, so that's that double-edged sword or difficulty with the, like, how do I balance, like, discussing this, knowing the difficulties with it, but still trying to give them agency in the process, because that's important, because they're amazing. Like, I try to tell my students, I'm someone who'd just be like, I can't do this, I'm out, like, after 20 rejections. But some of these people do it for the rest of their lives. And some of them get it and then die like the next year. And it's so sad because I'm like, oh, but guess what? You and I are talking about them. That's amazing.
Okay, I'm gonna postpone Barbara's question about newspapers one more time, because following on this idea, I want to ask why why they had to be demanded, why they had to demand not to be forgotten. Was there a deliberate process of forgetting? Because
Mm,
in my book, Smashing Statues, which just came out, about the history of American public monuments, I talk about
mm,
how Union monuments uh, almost never represents Black soldiers,
right.
USDP troops. So there, and I argue that there's a deliberate
Mm,
forgetting in public memory of the idea that African American people fought for their own freedom rather than just being handed
right.
emancipation as a gift. So was it a financial, like, oh, we don't want to pay these pensions, or do you think there's a bigger political attempts to forget the memory of
Oof.
these contributions?
But number one, I'm definitely going to be citing your book and future work going forward because you're making me like now I have all these ideas in my head. But you've raised a really important point because I'm seeing connections to Carolyn Janney and others who have even looked at Confederate monuments with daughters, the Confederacy and all that. And it's like shifting to the United States monuments. I do believe, thinking of Nina Silver's work on reunions and Keith Harris and others, that there's over time, not immediately, but I'd say it like a generation removed from the Civil War, that there starts to be this let's move forward. And particularly, it starts to really ramp up, as other people have noted, with the Spanish American Cuban Filipino War, when all of a sudden, like the whiteness and like this whole like view is just being is shifted. So I do, having said that, I know that there was at least presidential campaign in which President Harrison will get the presidency, and he, as the president-elect, will say that he has not forgotten Black soldiers' military service and that they're owed. So while monuments clearly are visible and symbolize so many different things, usually, as you know, particularly in the post Civil War era, they're in the South, demonstrations of white supremacy and all these horrific ideas and actions. But the pensions provide another way to recognize these people who were live, as others have noted, living monuments. And even in a rejection, that they are being remembered while they're not being celebrated in the term form of an actual statue. Of course, as they pass on, that becomes a problem. But even African Americans were saying that there seemed to be I don't want to say erasure, but like, let's move on from the Civil War. And this is from some of the veterans who become historians. They're just like, well, no one's remembering our story. So I guess we have to do it. And so I think it's a frustration. It's an anger, depending on the audience. Excuse me.
Okay, so Barbara's question, she asks if you could tell us again the names of the newspapers you mentioned as being sources.
Yes.
And
Yes.
if I could ask you to expand on that, what do Black newspapers have? Do they a different picture of the war than
Oh,
the white media?
yeah. So the first one published out in New York City. It was done by the Hamilton brothers. It published from 1859 to 1865. It was, again, the Weekly Anglo-African. I believe you can get it on microfilm, especially closer to where you all. It's amazing, and they make it very clear in their paper, like, we are a press about the Black experience and the Civil War. To be clear, though, they go through shifts. So they initially, in the first year and a half, they're ardently opposed because they see it as a white man's war. Though I would say it's a white person's war because white women were also involved in the war effort, and I want to recognize that. Once the shift happens over time, by 1863, they're all in, and they will start publishing recruitments. They will publish letters from soldiers while they train. They will publish letters from soldiers on the front lines. And this includes them complaining about pensions. This will include them talking about the training processes and military processions. And in New York, we'll have one of the most documented ones connected to the New York City draft riots. And then in 1864, the 20th United States Colored Infantry will parade down those same streets. And that is one of the most, like, when most people talk about Black military service, they always point to that parade because of how profound it was. And at least one of the soldiers I studied in my dissertation was a victim of that violence. And we'll talk about how they went in and burned his birth certificate, which later disqualified him from a pension generations later because he couldn't prove his story.
Wow.
I mean, so it's like the lingering effects of racial violence in New York, for example, unfortunately remain prevalent in some of these individuals' lives. The Christian Recorder, published out of Philadelphia, and it's still in publication. It's connected to the African Methodist Episcopalian Church. You can get it through, I get no money through this, to be clear. You can get it through, I think it's like archivesaccessible.com, and they have digitized versions of the records, and they're awesome. Like, I can't, they touch on, so just to give you an example, one thing that I found in both is there's a lot of conversations about the various informal recruitment processes. Most times it was going to be done at a Black church or an institution. So Frederick Douglass, Henry Helen Garnet, who will become the first chaplain, he's a New York preacher who then becomes a chaplain but is disqualified because he had an amputation, and it's a whole complicated process. They will go through the different churches and ask Black men to enlist. And there's one that was so profound because there was a white man in the audience, and Frederick Douglass is like, all right, stand up if you will enlist and serve. And no one does. And then a white man in the audience says, why should they? Like, what has this country shown them? And it was like, and the way the reporter was talking about it was just like, well, didn't see that coming. But it was like, they're very,
Wow.
yeah, it's, I haven't seen a lot of people talk about that event because it's like, how do y'all miss this one? But it's like,
Yeah,
there's
okay, you
so
need
much,
to also write a piece about that because
right?
that
Yeah, well,
is
I mean, the
amazing.
thing that I found really fascinating was there's some of the soldiers that were writing the letters, particularly to the Christian Recorder in Philly. I figured out later that they were actually soldiers I'm studying because I'm like, H. Harmon. Oh my gosh, that's Henry Harmon. That's the guy from blah blah blah. And I'm just like, so it made me a way to understand the soldier's experience, because I will argue that the press, they're giving more of a public facing view. So when they critique service, they'll say things like, we are being oppressed in terms of lack of equal pay. Our officers, most not all, are racist. They'll openly question, why are we in Texas when we fought and we're at Lee's surrender, which is something that deserves more attention. Black soldiers chased Robert E. Lee to Appomattox and were at that event. And then a number of them go to Texas and are directly involved in Juneteenth events. And it's amazing, but yet in the papers and in some of their personal letters, they're not giving the conversations we want when we talk about Juneteenth. They're saying I don't want to be here. The war is over. I'm tired. My family is hungry. I'm sick. I'm dying. What is the point? I was promised I would serve till this point. The war's been over. So it challenges how we, it's Juneteenth is extremely important. I'm so grateful. But it's more complicated than sometimes the discussions give it the acknowledgement of.
One of the monuments I look at my book is a Civil War memorial in Burlington, Vermont, which lists the citizens of the town that fought in the war, that injured, that died. But a couple of years ago, a group of middle schoolers dug into the records and found that those totals actually omitted the Black men who served from Burlington, including one who died in Texas of a fever after the war was over, not yet released from service. And then even that contribution is totally erased in the memorial that there is today. All right, we just have a couple more minutes left, so I will ask you, prompted by that idea of middle schoolers digging into these records and your discussion of these accessible and digitized records, do you ever encourage students to do their own research into these hidden histories, the family histories, personal histories that they see ignored by sort of academia or the media? What would you say to people who might want to get started on a project like that?
So I think first is Again, a lot of this depends on when things open up safely and allow for, like, the National Archives pretty much has all of the regimental books, which was usually my first starting point to get the names. But the one thing, and again, I say these getting no money from these organizations, to be clear, but ancestry.com and Fold3, sometimes you can just Google, if you look for United States Colored Troops records, you can find, like, if you were to type in New York City, and look, I guarantee you will find, or up Buffalo, New York, you will find a number of these individuals, and you can look through their records and find, for example, how old they were, or at least how old they say they were, the name either that they now go by. For example, one of the soldiers that I've written about it for Black Respect, or I think it was for Muster. He says he was born in New York, but after 20 years later, he admitted, okay, I was a runaway enslaved man from Tennessee, and he will become a sheep herder in Australia. And I argue that his movements were ways in which he was demonstrating cultural citizenship long before he was recognized as like a citizen of the United States. Civil War pension records are gold mines. Fold3 does have some, and if I were to share, and I'm happy to afterwards, if anyone wants to look at some New York soldiers, for example, their medical histories, their histories of disability, their histories of employment, their histories of families, because the records say so much. For example, if I was testifying as a witness to someone else's case, for a number of African Americans, this is the only time that they're going to tell this lengthy story. So I might be here talking about John Smith, but all of a sudden I'm like, okay, so let me tell you my story real quick. So my father, and so all of a sudden you'll see this like massive chunk of information that I'm going, what does this have to do with the case? But then I realized, oh, this is actually important. And some of them will say, look, we were friends together as children. So you actually get to learn more about the communities, even if they're not necessarily the soldiers. Pension records, you'll never know what you're going to find. I mean, to be honest, the most difficult part is the handwriting, to be honest, and because it can evolve over time, because so many different individuals will be the ones categorizing it, but you also have to read for the silences. And I'll just say that Black women's voices are there always, and they are very clear in their demands to be heard. And so what I mean by that is, for example, one daughter, her father will pass in 1911. She will write the Bureau of Pensions every month for like 2 years and demand to be paid, reimbursed for her father's funeral expenses, the undertaker, and all that. And I just like, man, like this is a lot of information. And then eventually I saw the last letter, the Pension Bureau just goes, look, if you'll stop writing us, we'll give you the money. And I was like, to me, I was like, okay, that was amazing, because she clearly frustrated, annoyed them enough, but she was so persistent, and she demanded that their family's hardships and sacrifices be remembered, that the federal government agency gave up and did pay her. And that is agency. And it's like that's the kind of stuff that I think is the beauty, even when some of these records are hard, and they are, the conversations about domestic violence. I was not ready for that. Like, as I read the records, and it's bad, because we know it's PTSD. Some of the soldiers were openly trying to kill their children and wives because they're coming home with trauma. I mean, it's a whole list of things. And going back to your point, these records and doing this work allowed me to answer things about my own story. I'm the child of someone who served. My mother served for 25 years, right? And I've always struggled when people in general talk about military service, and they'll say things to her like, thank you for her service, and they don't recognize what it was like for me, my family, my grandma, our community when she got deployed internationally, how I would be shipped somewhere else, and how I also used to be so angry at the federal government because I believed they were taking my mom away. And it was like that kind of hurt and that kind of just confusion. I wanted to apply that to people who lived through one of the most fundamentally important moments in American history. What must it have been like to be your family members seen as heroes on a national stage, to maybe have a monument or some event recognizing them? But as I point in the book, the money is not going to replace what you've lost, the emotional loss, the psychological loss, or those who come home with disabilities. And the disabilities take different forms, sometimes extremely graphic. One of the soldiers will have his jaw like shot off and will never masticate for the remainder of his life. I've written about a widow whose husband will have a cannon shell that will be permanently lodged in his head, and he will go clinically insane, as we would know. The Bureau will later say when he dies, you can't prove that that shell is connected to the Civil War. And I remember like calling someone like cursing because I was like, this is, like, are you serious? Like, you don't, like, this doesn't just happen. And then they will do this invasive examination into her life and ultimately disqualify her because of a rumor she was a sex worker. And everyone said that was a lie concocted by the neighborhood because people didn't like her. And it didn't matter to the federal government. And it's like those kind of stories are coming through in the pensions. You will never know what you're going to find. I cannot stress enough how amazing the sources are. And I know we have to go, but I at least wanted to say as someone who did go to community college, like I love that experience. This work, which is like weird to say, maybe not, also comes from my obsession with the film Glory. Right? Like I love Denzel and like that movie, and I watch it and will cry, like, and I've seen it 1,000 times. But it was like I was always left with the question of what does it mean if we look at the people connected to them? So Morgan Freeman, has one of the famous lines in there, when I left my kinfolk in Bundy. That line always stays with me because I'm sitting there going, what about them? What happened to them? And Black women were always visible in military spaces. And Thavalia Glimp, for example, and others have noted this. And it's like they were the ones who created the regimental flags that soldiers took into service and will pledge their lives to not let it hit the ground. So what I'm saying, and others will say, is that means Black women were always in the war because those flags were representations of their patriotism and their sacrifices and their hard work. It was never a male domain. So it's just like sometimes the inspiration for why to do the history could come from something you just randomly are interested in. So sometimes watching a movie can provide you with those like, hey, I have questions.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Pinheiro, for talking to us. I wish I could hear you talking for so much longer, but we can buy your book. I put in a link in the chat. And thank you for showing us that following your passions and your obsessions can
Yes,
lead
definitely
to such
obsessions.
important work.